So the mainline project is really inspired, initially inspired by the work of William Rowell, who in the 19th century created works for the Pennsylvania Railroad. And the project's a dialogue. It's a dialogue with historical imagery. It's a dialogue with the landscape and, of course, the railroad. For me, I'm kind of seeking to understand the corridor and the places and the things that evolved around it. In 2021, the Center for Railroad Photo and Art produced a book titled Railroad and the Art of Place. And it's a publication that considers space and time across the American landscape while examining the railroad industry's history, physical presence. My contribution to that publication was a 20-image portfolio and an essay that broadly talks about the Pennsylvania Railroad main line. During that initial pitch, I had actually put together several selections of imagery for the editors, varying from a wide survey, which ended up getting taken, to more specific portfolios that dealt with just the Philadelphia and Middle divisions, which I've spent a lot of time on. So while the editors went with a wider selection, the Middle division collection really got me thinking about some ideas of how to take a wider look, not just at the railroad, but more importantly, the river it follows, the Juniata. The Juniata, whose name is thought to derive from the Iroquoian word Juniata, meaning standing stone, is roughly 104 miles long, encompassing 3,400 square miles of watershed. The valley was said to be the home of roughly 4 tribes of Native Americans collectively associated with the Lenni Lenape Indians. By the first and second quarter of the 1700s, non-native traders often navigated the banks and waters of the Juniata. And by 1741, Irish-Scottish settlers began to call the Juniata Valley home. And by 1750s, we start to see the names familiar that we're familiar with today in the Juniata Valley as settlers started to create towns and villages along the river. By the early 1800s, the race to push westward began in earnest as the construction of the Erie Canal commenced in 1817. In 1827, the charter was granted for the construction of the Baltimore and Ohio. And in 1828, the C&O Canal commenced construction generally on the same course. Philadelphia and the Commonwealth realized that they needed to secure a western route for trade from Philadelphia in order to remain competitive. Thus, the main line of public works, a state-owned system of canals, railroad, and inclined planes, commenced construction in 1826 and was completed in 1834. This included the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad, the Juniata Division Canal, the Allegheny Portage Railroad, and the Western Division of the canal. Despite the modern engineering of the main line of public works, the Erie Canal had a significant advantage. It only had 83 locks and 363 miles with an elevation change of only 654 feet. In contrast, the Juniata and Western divisions of the public works faced an elevation change of 1,168 feet, utilizing 167 locks over 276 miles, plus 10 inclined planes over the Allegheny Range. In 1839, the Commonwealth commissioned, no, you're behind. Okay. And that should circulate one more time. Nope. You know what? Just go back to it. This is supposed to have a video component and it didn't carry through to the PDF. So in 1839, with the main line of public works struggling, the Commonwealth commissioned Charles Schlatter to survey potential rail routes for a continuous route across Pennsylvania. The report was presented to Senate in 1841, and Schlatter surveyed 3 routes: the northern, middle, and southern. From his reconnaissance, the middle route was recommended as the most ideal path for construction of a railroad. The middle route followed the Susquehanna north from Harrisburg, diverging to follow the Juniata River west, and the proposed route followed the Juniata to Lewistown, diverging along the Kishiqualis Creek, for a short distance and turning west to follow the valley north of the mountains bearing the same name. The route then returns to the Juniata Valley at Mill Creek, moving west through Huntington to Petersburg, and at Petersburg, the route roughly follows the Little Juniata to Bald Eagle Creek in the proximity of where Tyrone is, taking a path following the Little Juniata to Dragoon Run, and ultimately to climb the Allegheny Range. The Schlatter survey never materialized for the public works, but in 1846, the PA legislature passed an act to charter a private railroad across the Commonwealth, the Pennsylvania Railroad. The caveat of the Pennsylvania Railroad's charter was if they could secure funding and construct a percentage of line by a prescribed date, the Pennsylvania Railroad would be granted the charter to Pittsburgh, asserting dominance then by pushing out the Baltimore and Ohio. If they failed, the Baltimore and Ohio would win their case and secure the route from Baltimore, leaving Pennsylvania at a major disadvantage. The new railroad tasked Chief Engineer J. Edgar Thompson with the job of laying out the road and getting construction underway. Thompson basically followed Schlatter's proposed middle route via the Susquehanna and Juniata west to the Allegheny Range. The most significant deviations from the middle route was the choice to follow the Juniata westward between Lewistown and Mill Creek and to stay southeast of the Little Juniata in Blair County from Tyrone to Altoona. By December of 49, the railroad reached McVaytown, 72 miles from Harrisburg, and by April of the following year, it reached Schaefer's Aqueduct near Mount Union, and by June, it reached Huntington, and late in September of 1850, the PRR made connection to the Portage Railroad in Hollidaysburg, a total distance of 137 miles from Harrisburg. By the middle of February of 1854, the Mountain Division is completed, giving the Pennsylvania Railroad its own dedicated route from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh, completing the difficult route between Petersburg via the Little Juniata to Tyrone, Altoona, and over the Alleghenies via Horseshoe Kirk. In the next 50 years, the Pennsylvania Railroad would grow from a trans-Commonwealth operation to ultimately become one of the largest rail systems in the United States. Double tracking the line began in the late 1850s, and the massive system improvements of Chief Engineer William H. Brown from 1880s to the early 1900s would forever change the landscape to what we know as the Pennsy today. Throughout this explosive period of growth, and lasting well into the 20th century, Pennsylvania Railroad turned to another product of the modern age to chronicle its achievements: photography. Photography grew to prominence alongside the rise of the railroad, became the new way of disseminating the world, and the Pennsylvania Railroad's photographic commissions produced photomechanical illustrations, stereo cards, mammoth plates, and etchings. Living in hotels abroad, travel guides and keepsakes, and printed in literature for the railroad ranging from annual reports to passenger marketing pieces. From after the Civil War, well into the 1920s, the Pennsylvania Railroad employed, among others, pre-noted photographers to illustrate their road in situ, celebrating a technological marvel while illustrating the landscape that the road traveled. William T. Purviance was designated the Pennsylvania Railroad's official photographer in 1867. He maintained studios in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, publishing views under the name Purviance's Views on the Pennsylvania Central Railroad and Scenery of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Frederick Gudekunst was commissioned in 1875 to produce photographs of the railroad in time for the 1876 Centennial Exposition. The New York Herald quipped that Gudekunst's work played a prominent role presenting large landscape views along the Pennsylvania Railroad at the exposition. Gudekunst made his mark in photography during the Civil War, recording portraits of soldiers, generals, and other prominent Union Army officers, as well as landscapes capturing the essence of historically significant locations from the war. Finally, from 1887 to 1924, Philadelphia photographer William H. Rowell produced over 3,843 negatives for the Pennsylvania Railroad. His best-known work was commissioned to hang at the Pennsylvania Railroad's Pavilion, Columbian Exposition in 1893, produced over 2 campaigns in 1891 and 1893, just prior to the exposition. A later portfolio work from Rowell dates from 1905 to 1907 detailing some of the key projects during the end of Brown's tenure as chief engineer and the beginning of Cassatt's improvement era. These commercial commissions drive home a message of sophisticated, new, and modern way of transportation while paying homage to academic schools of history and landscape painting, understanding the importance of historical sites and relics of a previous era. The collection of images here ranges roughly from 1867 to 1907 along the Middle Division and the Juniata River. It's historical imagery like this, while its intent was very different at its inception, that for me brings new value to the landscape from a contemporary context. It is the material that I draw the greatest inspiration from when creating my own photographs. Traveling east to west, we started the third and final iteration of Rockville Bridge, just completed a few years prior and beautifully photographed by Raoul using a circuit camera to make a stunning 68 by 17-inch platinum contact print. Just upriver near Fort Hunter, the remains of the Northern Central Bridge, viewed from the east bank of the Susquehanna, with Cove Mountain rising in the background. At Duncannon, we see the recently completed 4-track main line in the vicinity of JO, or later View Interlocking Tower. The stacks of the Duncannon Ironworks stand on the left. According to historical reports, at this point, the works was just down to nail production, and the following year it would cease altogether. In the distance to the right is the expansive river valley that marks the confluence of the Juniata and Susquehanna rivers. Iron production in the Juniata Valley was prevalent for more than half a century. The Caroline furnace operated roughly until the Civil War along the Juniata Division Canal. In a nod to the past and in tradition to historical painting, Rao depicts the derelict furnace in Baileysburg in 1893. Following along Oxbow, we approach Trimmer's Rock circa 1870. And this later view shows Trimmer's Rock in the distance looking east. In another nod to history, Rao opted to include the stranded canal boats in the foreground, making them central to the composition. At this point, the railroad had begun realignment of the main line in the area of Newport, which was actually spurned by the great floods of 1889. The canal bed in the foreground was at this point just an isolated stretch running only to Newport in the immediate west. This 1875 view shows the original main line through Newport alongside the Marshall Furnace. Toward the turn of the century, the railroad expanded its 4-track system, relocating its main away from the center of town. The result was the filling in of the canal and the elevation of the right-of-way to skirt the, eastern edge of town. Well into the Juniata Valley, looking east towards Mexico, shows the 2-track main line and a substantial covered bridge in the distance at Mexico. The use of the word slip rock in this title is reference to the shaly loose rock that you can see in the midground there that was prone to slides. PV Interlocking, whose call letters relate back to the town's previous name of Perrysville, marks the town of Port Royal, where expansion of the 4-track main line has reached an end at this time in 1891. Situated in a wide, fertile valley where the Tuscarora Creek empties into the Juniata, Port Royal was the terminal of the narrow gauge railroad Tuscarora Valley, which brought goods down from the valley to export via the Pennsylvania Railroad. West of Mifflin, the Juniata threads through a narrow gap between Log and Shade Mountains known as the Lewistown Narrows. Here, the canal and the railroad navigated the gap on opposing sides of the Juniata. Hallstone, loaded deep in the Narrows, is the site of an early track tank arrangement where steam engines could take on water at speed. As we exit the Narrows from the west end, this dramatic view looking east shows the entrance to the Narrows and the Pennsylvania Railroad right-of-way winding along the right side of the banks of the river's edge. In this 1875 stereo view by Gudekunst, we can see the area of Lewistown Junction in relation to the city of Lewistown in the distance. Lewistown Station was built in 1849, making it the oldest surviving structure built by the Pennsylvania Railroad. And while the Pennsylvania Railroad Tech and Historical Society's archives weren't there yet, pretty sure Charlie Horan is sitting on the platform. McVeytown is located in the valley of rich farmland framed by Blue Mountain in the distance. Of note, immediately to the right is a boarding house shrouded by the tree, dating to 1850, opening just a couple months after the railroad was completed, which still remains today. In a beautiful scene, we see the long curve coming out of the east to the right of the frame, and a very still Juniata. The fertile lowlands of the Juniata are very evident in this section of the river where the valley widens out. This is the long curve east of Rye. Not far from the previous view, we see the original Manayunk Bridge crossing the Pennsylvania Canal in the foreground and the Juniata between Ryde and Vineyard. This bridge would be replaced by a new alignment complete with the Stone Arch Bridge at Ryde in an effort to eliminate a series of curves negotiating the river oxbows. Approaching Mount Union, Gudikant's specially appointed train stands in the foreground as he aims the large plate camera towards the Juniata Bridge and Schaefer's Aqueduct crossing the Juniata. Visible in the distance is the narrow gap in Jack's Mountain, carved by the Juniata, known as Jack's Narrows. The Narrows run here over 2 miles in length between the towns of Mount Union and Mapleton. Jack's Mountain itself soars 2,321 feet and creates a narrow gorge funneling the Juniata River, the canal, the middle division, of course, later U.S. Highway Route 22. The railroad runs on the southern bank, leaving Mount Union's interchange with the East Broadtop Railroad behind, heading west to remerge in Mapleton. The name of the mountain and the Narrows took their name from Captain Jack Armstrong, an early pioneer and Indian trader who traversed the area frequently from roughly 1730 to 1744. Armstrong was allegedly murdered by Indians and buried on the Juniata shore near this famous gateway. Illustrating the narrow valley, the stereo view shows the main line, the Juniata Division Canal, and a quarry road that reaches Ganister Rock quarries on the far side, crossing the Juniata. This area was rich with Ganister rock, which made it an ideal place for the production of silica brick. At one time, Mount Union was home to 3 producers of these refractory bricks. Lost during the Pennsylvania Railroad's improvements around the turn of the century is much of the canal bed, which was filled in to expand the right-of-way. Here we see lift block 32 in the Narrows itself, and this is looking east. Not far from Lock 32, the canal actually takes a hard turn crossing the Juniata at the Jackstown Aqueduct toward the west end of the Narrows. And this late view from Rowell in 1907 reveals a very different landscape as the canal's completely been filled in. You can see fresh cutting on the hillside, and it basically shows the improved and expanded right-of-way within the vicinity of Jack's Tower, or MU Tower, which is visible in the distance. The valley opens up to the west just enough to provide land for the village of Mapleton. Again, with the quarrying of Ganister rock, you can see the scars on the hillsides for where it was easy to mine the rock for silica brick purposes, for production of silica brick, rather. An early view of Mapleton shows the 2-track right-of-way and depot of Mapleton, framed with the steep elevation of Jack's Mountain in the distance. And leaving the Narrows behind, the Juniata again begins, the valley again begins to widen, offering expanded views and rich agricultural spaces along the valley floor. This elevated view at Mill Creek illustrates the grade separation of the Pennsylvania Railroad right-of-way, the widening of the valley. Had Schlatter had his way constructing the railroad, at this point, moving eastward, the railroad would have deviated from the Juniata following the Mill Creek up to the Kishiquellis Valley and towards Lewistown, opposite the mountains on the left. CH Tower in Ardenheim, looking east with Jack's Mountain in the background. And details of two Gudikun stereo views providing opposing views of the canal and right away along the Juniata as the railroad approaches Huntington. This area was always referred to as hieroglyphic rocks, and if you look carefully, you can see where people have written their names all over the rocks, sort of a 19th century version of graffiti. This 1875 view shows the original alignment of the main line heading into Huntington at the mouth of Standing Stone Creek. The canal obviously would ultimately be filled in, and the right-of-way swung to the south to eliminate street running down Allegheny Street. At Petersburg, the railroad initially followed the canal along with the Frankstown branch of the Juniata to Hollidaysburg, where it connected with the Allegheny Portage Railroad until the Mountain Division was completed in 1854. The construction of the line from Petersburg to Altoona via Tyrone along the Little Juniata was a particularly rugged and challenging stretch to engineer a railroad and was completed just in time to connect to the Mountain Division. Visible here is the east portal of the Spruce Creek Tunnel, where Tussey Mountain presented such a formidable barrier the railroad was forced to tunnel through. The bore, completed in 1848, was later reinforced, enlarged, and supplemented during various eras of expansion and improvements. The narrowing valley and winding Little Juniata is evident in distance and necessitated the railroad to cross the river 12 times in the next 10 miles. For obvious reasons, when the Pennsylvania Railroad began to expand to the 4-track main line, the best they ever did in this stretch was 3 tracks. It was deemed far too expensive to do otherwise. An example of one of the earlier iron truss bridges is seen here, looking towards number 3 bridge, east of Union Furnace. And one of its successors is seen further upstream at bridge number 5. Stone became the material of choice between 1887 and roughly 1910, earning Pennsylvania Railroad Chief Engineer William H. Brown the nickname the Stone Man for his preference of this style of construction. Jumping ahead to Birmingham, we get a clear view of the challenges Little Juniata posed in the valley for the railroad. The winding river was bridged again immediately west of Birmingham, and you can actually notice in the foreground the fresh debris and stone, which is likely the result of just completing this bridge. Birmingham and the general area of the Little Juniata and to the northeast was rich with iron deposits, making an ideal environment for quarrying and forging. The later view from Goody Kinstier in 1875, we can see the Irish Flats covered bridge crossing the Little J and leading to the Birmingham station at right. The village itself sits just above the tree lines on the other side of the hill. The final crossing of the Little Juniata and Tyrone Forge was bridge number 12, later replaced with the stone structure like many of the others. The Exton Bridge in 1875 was unique in that it deviated from the Pennsylvania Railroad's use of iron and steel reinforced truss bridges. This was listed as an iron boilerplate deck truss bridge, according to the 1854 annual report. Entering the flats where Bald Eagle Creek and the Little Juniata converge, Tyrone was situated at the head of Bald Eagle and Brush Mountains. You'll notice in the gap in the middle where the main line enters to Tyrone and arcs to the right along the base of Brush Mountain. Leaving the tortuous Little Juniata for the open valley and the foothills of the Alleghenies, the 4-track Broadway is readily evident in this 1891 view of DI interlocking in Bellwood. And finally, arriving in Altoona, William Rowe's photographic special rests under the shed of the Altoona station adjacent to the Logan House. Even by this time, the ornate train shed was beginning to look too small for the ever-growing equipment of a railroad about to earn its name, the standard railroad of the world. Examining 40 years worth of change in the 19th and 20th century and considering the modern landscape while understanding the significant change that took place on the Pennsylvania Railroad main line with the demise of the PRR, the advent of the Penn Central, Conrail, and now Norfolk Southern, the question becomes, how do you celebrate a road that was gone long before I even began to make this work? So it's drawing from the previous gallery of work that I set out to make my own photographs, not necessarily to recreate, but to reference historical views, formally and conceptually, to evoke a presence of a railroad that's gone by celebrating what remains. The 1902 Rockville Bridge, seen here upstream from Heckton Mills with Blue Mountain in the distance. This northward view of the Susquehanna Valley from Blue Mountain, showing the Dolphin Narrows where the Susquehanna cut its way through the valley. To the left being Cove Mountain, to the right being Second Mountain. The new bridge at Sherman's Creek with Peters Mountain in view. Sherman's Creek empties into the Susquehanna just below the confluence of the Juniata and Susquehanna rivers on the southern edge of Duncannon, Pennsylvania. The former Pennsylvania Railroad depot stands at the foot of Cumberland Street in Duncannon, PA. Depots of a similar design were also constructed in Marysville and Newport. At Clark's Ferry, the expansive valley reveals the confluence of the Susquehanna at the left, the Juniata at the far right, and Sherman's Creek where the stone bridge is visible in the distant center. The remains of the Caroline Furnace and Bailey's with an eastbound Pennsylvanian passing in the background. At this point, the right-of-way here is the product of improvements at the turn of the century, which ultimately eliminated the canal bed that once served this furnace before the Civil War. On the west end of Newport, the mouth of Buffalo Creek, there's an early example of one of the first stone bridges constructed along the original main line, juxtaposed with one of the much larger modern spans to the right when the Pennsylvania Railroad expanded between the 1890s and 1910.
Is the original bridge still used for anything, or?
It is, yeah. There's a yeah. In this landscape, yeah, you want to go back to share. There you go. All right, in Lewistown Narrows of Macedonia, the tender's house and lift block number 13 have been preserved along the east side of the river. This particular section of the Juniata Division Canal actually remained in operation between Lewistown and Mifflin until 1889. And opposite, just upstream, is evidence of an early stone wall constructed by the Pennsylvania Railroad in the area of Hallstone. Obscured in the tree line of that previous view stands the remains of the Hallstone Water Station. Sandwiched between the railroad and Route 333 stands the walled cistern and gatehouse that fed the track pans below on the right-of-way. The cistern is unique in that the north wall is an exposed stone wall and not an earthen embankment. The gatehouse is typical of several facilities constructed around the turn of the century and likely supported a conical slate roof. West of Hallstone shows just the sheer elevation change of Shade Mountain along the far riverbank. And at Lewistown Junction, behind the depot, is a scene reminiscent of many post-industrial era towns across Pennsylvania. The rail yard in the foreground provided connection to the Mifflin and Center County Railroad, which ultimately became part of the Sunbury and Lewistown. In the distance is Charlie Horan standing near the American Visco facility to produce the synthetic fabric rayon, along other materials. Charlie probably, nah, I don't want to deal with you. The Mifflin Center County Railroad branches off from the main line in the area of Lewistown Station, a plot that is really isolated from the town because of the Juniata River. The railroad crosses this multi-span plate girder bridge into the town of Lewistown proper. West of Lewistown, this triptych illustrates the landscape of the Juniata, illustrating some of the challenges the Pennsylvania Railroad encountered when blazing a straight path through the valley. The Granville loops of the Juniata are crossed several times in short succession with the Granville and Mays Bridge. At the Mays Bridge, evidence survives of the earlier iron bridge dating from the 1860s expansion to a two-track railroad utilizing iron truss spans. And at Longfellow, a tangent stretch of main line ends as the railroad arcs around the base of Blue Mountain. In McVeytown, the depot is long gone, but the boarding house seen previously survives. In relatively decent shape, you can note the inscription on the left corner of the building that says it was completed in 1850, constructed just after the railroad reached town. At Vineyard, the remains of the original alignment are evident from the stone piers that once supported an iron truss bridge before the railroad was straightened and relocated through the area, replaced with the stone bridge at Ryde to the east. In the areas between McVeytown and Mount Union, there are several areas where the canal prism is still clearly visible. This view in the area near Newton Hamilton. Entering Mount Union, the railroad crosses one of the later stone bridges constructed on the Middle Division, completed in 1906. The aqueduct of the Juniata Division Canal would have stood in the immediate foreground. Bridge 124's builder plate notes that chief engineer on record was actually Alexander C. Shand, William Brown's successor, signifying the winding down of Brown's career and the succession of Stan taking the helm. While Brown was so well known for his stone bridges, Shand would ultimately veer away from that tradition, employing more reinforced concrete bridges and retaining walls in the near future. The old main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad, like in so many other locations, dissected town centers, sometimes even running in the street, posing obviously a major safety issue and operational headaches as the railroad grew larger. Part of those improvement efforts during the late 19th and early 20th centuries was to grade separate the main line and run trains unimpeded. The result of this trend, often left spurs or secondary routes the railroad retained for access to industries or interchanges with other railroads. Mount Union, of course, being the interchange with the narrow gauge railroad, the East Broadtop, and also to service significant business from the refractory brick manufacturers. Mount Union was at the east end of the Lewistown Narrows, an area covered quite well by the historical views. And this segment is still a very difficult place to get to, being a remote area between Mount Union and Mapleton. This was the result of a long hike back from the west. But perhaps the best view of the Narrows is from above. The 1,000 Steps Trail was a trail built by quarrymen to access operations high above on Jack's Mountain, where Ganister rock was quarried and utilized to manufacture silica brick. It's hard to imagine having to climb up these 1,000 steps every morning and every night after a long, hard day of manual labor. I've hiked this thing and I can say they lied. It's more than 1,000 steps, more like 1,300.
Is that the pathway there on the right?
No, that's 22 down on the right, and the road that dissects off to Mapleton. Down in the Narrows, the Juniata Canal crossed the river at a sharp angle, going from south to north, and that was at Jackstown Aqueduct. The remains of the stone piers have stood the test of time in that river for almost 200 years. West of the Narrows, the village of Mapleton stands in the shadow of Jack's Mountain, where this old house stands sentinel along the main line, probably having witnessed more than 100 years of operations along the railroad, not quite as old as Charlie. In a nod to William Rao, we see the face of Sidling Hill and Terrace Mountain to the left, and possibly Stone Ridge in the distance, signifying that we're approaching Huntington. Entering Huntington, one crosses Standing Stone Creek. Another case of improvements is evident from Uticant's view in 1875. The old alignment ran down Allegheny Street, which stands in the foreground, while the later relocated and expanded line occupies with a canal aqueduct across Standing Stone Creek. You'll notice that the newer bridge in the distance was originally of stone construction and has later been reinforced and faced with concrete. In Huntington, along Allegheny Street, stands the original Italianate brick station, dating from 1872. The opposite side of the structure originally served the railroad until the railroad relocated. Improvements were made in several stages here. Eliminating the canal started in 1891, with further work in 1894 through 1900. On the opposite side of the Pennsylvania Railroad, there was a cross-platform connection to be made with the standard gauge Huntington and Broadtop Mountain Railway. Near Alexandria, the remains of the Petersburg branch crosses the Little Juniata. This branch was the original route constructed in the 1840s following the Juniata Division Canal to connect with the Allegheny Portage Railroad in Hollidaysburg, prior to completion of the Mountain Division. Having been revived several times over its life, the route along the Frankstown branch of the Juniata served as a relief valve for the main line during peak times of traffic. Looking west toward Tussey Mountain, the Barry Strait blazes a path toward one of the more complicated pieces of the division. Pulled through in 1849, the tunnel through Tussey Mountain, commonly referred to as Spruce Creek Tunnel, now stands abandoned. With a sharp oxbow in the Little Juniata and nowhere to go with the railroad, they were faced with no choice but to tunnel through the ridge. Completed in 1849, later expanded and receiving a masonry portal, the tunnel was later supplemented with a new alignment and tunnel to the north, completed in 1889. As late as Conrail's clearance improvement projects in the 90s, the original board was ultimately retired after the new tunnel was expanded. And since then, the tunnel has had a repeated history of cave-ins and structural problems that makes it unpassable. As we leave Spruce Creek, we enter the 10-mile stretch of railroad where engineers were faced with the expensive reality that they had to bridge Little Juniata 12 times between Spruce Creek and Tyrone Forge. This trackside view is at the first bridge, bridge number 1. During the era of improvements in the area of bridge number 3, there was a relocation of a curve and an elimination of an iron bridge that was then supplemented by a new stone bridge. Upstream from the new bridge number 3 stands the original piers of the first bridge number 3 constructed in the 1850s, back in the woods, deep behind Union Furnace. Highlighted by a fresh layer of snow, bridge 6 spans the Little Juniata at Jensenmore Run. This gives evidence that even Brown's stone bridges needed care over the years, and often in the form of reinforcement steel bars and concrete is evident on the facade of the bridge. Throughout this segment of the railroad, the river and the railroad executed carefully choreographed dance as the railroad attempted to push a straight line across a windy river. The bare trees reveals the splintered paths of the stream approaching Birmingham. And at Plummer's Hollow, the Lewisburg and Tyrone branch splits from the main line, heading east into Center County to serve the Pennsylvania Furnace and later Taft Carnegie iron ore deposits via the branch constructed to Scotia. Known as the Fairbrook branch, the L&T had an interesting backstory of a line that was never realized in its entirety. Of note, the deck truss span here is said to have been salvaged and repurposed as one of the original iron spans that crossed the Conemaugh in Johnstown before the stone bridge at Johnstown was built, which was replaced by the ominous stone bridge that played such a central role in the 1889 flood at Johnstown. Under the Y of the Bald Eagle Branch and along the Blue Juniata, the backside of Tyrone is visible from the area that used to support a sizable station and rail yard. And entering the sprawling Altoona terminal area, one could spend an hour just discussing the evolution of facilities and operations here. WJ was the apex of the hump for westbound empty classification, a castle-like structure. Was constructed of sandstone and sat on the apex or sat on the top of this stone flyover, with the main line passing underneath via 380-foot tunnel. The bridge replaced the tunnel during the Conrail's clearance improvement projects of the 1889, and the hump is long out of service, which much of this trackage was grown in. Opposite and further west is the Juniata Scales, located at the apex of the eastbound classification yard. The facility dates from 1927 and also stands dormant, most likely to never serve its intended use again. West of the sprawling Altoona shops, the railroad threads its way through the terminal area, approaching the Altoona passenger station and preparing for the short, intense climb up the eastern face of the Allegheny Range. And finally, we close with a structure that has stood sentinel along the main line and denotes the end of the middle division. JK, or later known as Alto Tower, stands guard at the right-of-way as the right-of-way narrows to 3 tracks, leaving the south end of town to wind its way up Dragoon Run and over Horseshoe Curve. So why is all this work important, both historic and contemporary? We all relate to places through photographs and through memory. With the ever-changing nature of humans, we eliminate, destroy, and alter things of the past. It's just part of our culture, and unfortunately, preservation can only save so much of it. For me, that is where photography comes into play. My efforts to preserve these scenes and have them reside in institutions where they can be utilized to understand the continual change in the landscape, alongside historical imagery like that from Rao and Goodykins, is really what motivates me. The railroad, the built environment, to continue a long-standing tradition of photographic illustration, from anywhere from large-scale engineering and construction projects to just simple small-town views, in hopes that it reaches a diverse audience and provide a way to connect to provide a way for audiences to connect to places, home or away, foreign or familiar, to understand how to read the landscape and to appreciate its history. Thank you.